A kind doctor named Dr. Lawson saves a black baby's life, but years later he is shaken by tragic news that leaves him speechless. What heartbreaking truth is about to be revealed, and how will it change everything he thought he knew? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Dr. James Lawson strolled through the park, his hands tucked into his pockets as the cool breeze rustled the leaves overhead. The golden light of late afternoon cast long shadows across the grass, but James barely noticed the beauty around him. His heart felt heavy, weighed down by the loneliness that had become his constant companion since losing his beloved wife. As he walked along the winding path, James couldn't help but think about the life he'd imagined for himself. A house filled with the laughter of children, family dinners around a crowded table, and the joy of watching little ones grow. But fate had other plans, and now he found himself alone, his dreams of fatherhood slipping further away with each passing year. Lost in his thoughts, James almost missed the sound at first. A faint whimper carried on the wind, so soft he wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. He paused, tilting his head to listen. There it was again, the unmistakable cry of a baby. His heart racing, James followed the sound. It led him off the path and towards a nearby bench. As he drew closer, the cries grew louder, more insistent. And then he saw it, a small bundle wrapped in a faded blue blanket, tucked beneath the bench. James's breath caught in his throat as he knelt down. With trembling hands, he gently pulled back the blanket to reveal the face of a beautiful black baby boy. The child's eyes were squeezed shut, tiny fists waving in the air as he wailed. "Oh, little one," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What are you doing out here all alone?" He looked around frantically, searching for any sign of the baby's parents. But the park was empty, save for a few distant joggers. A cold realization settled in his stomach. This precious child had been abandoned. Carefully, James carried the baby into his arms. The moment he cradled the little boy against his chest, something extraordinary happened. The baby's cries softened, and he blinked up at James with wide, curious eyes. James felt his heart swell with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was a mixture of protectiveness, wonder, and a deep, instant love that took his breath away. As he gazed down at the innocent face, James knew his life would never be the same. James cradled the baby close to his chest, his heart racing with a mixture of concern and newfound purpose. He knew he couldn't leave the child alone in the park. Without hesitation, he made his way to the nearest hospital, his protective instincts kicking into high gear. As he entered the emergency room, James called out, "I need help. I found this baby abandoned in the park." The staff sprang into action, gently taking the infant from James's arms and whisking him away for a thorough examination. James felt a pang in his chest as he watched the baby disappear behind swinging doors. "Doc, can you tell us what happened?" a kind-faced nurse asked, leading James to a quiet corner of the waiting room. James recounted the story, his voice trembling with emotion. As he spoke, he realized just how deeply the child had already touched his heart. The nurse assured him they would take good care of the baby and thanked him for his quick thinking. Left alone with his thoughts, James sank into an uncomfortable plastic chair. His mind raced with possibilities. Could he keep the baby? The idea both thrilled and terrified him. He had always longed for a child, and now, by some twist of fate, one had quite literally been placed in his path. James closed his eyes, imagining what it would be like to bring the little boy home, to watch him grow, to love him, to be the father he had always dreamed of becoming. A tear slipped down his cheek as he pictured it all so vividly. Hours passed, and James refused to leave, anxiously awaiting news about the baby's condition. Finally, a doctor approached him with a gentle smile. "Dr. Lawson, the baby is doing well. He's a bit dehydrated, but otherwise healthy," the doctor explained. James let out a sigh of relief, his shoulders sagging. "That's wonderful news. Can I see him?" The doctor's expression turned apologetic. "I'm afraid that's not possible right now. We've contacted social services and they'll be taking over from here." James felt his heart sink. The thought of the baby being taken away, thrust into the system, made his chest ache. But I found him," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Isn't there anything I can do?" The doctor placed a comforting hand on James's shoulder. "I understand this is difficult, but there are procedures we must follow. Social services will ensure the child is placed in a safe environment." James nodded numbly, but inside he felt a fierce protectiveness rising. He couldn't bear the thought of never seeing the baby again. In just a few short hours, that tiny boy had awakened something in James, a love he never knew he was capable of feeling. James trudged into his empty house, his mind still filled with thoughts of the baby boy he had found. The silence that greeted him felt heavier than ever before. He sank into his favorite armchair, but found no comfort in its familiar embrace. His eyes wandered to the framed photo of his late wife on the mantel. "Oh, Margaret," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You would have loved that little one." Unable to shake the image of the helpless child from his mind, James reached for his phone with trembling hands. He hesitated for a moment, then dialed the number for social services. "Hello, this is Dr. James Lawson," he said when someone answered. "I'm calling about a baby that was brought in earlier today. I was the one who found him." The social worker on the other end listened patiently as James explained the situation. "I see, Dr. Lawson," she said kindly. "The baby has been placed in temporary foster care while we search for a more permanent solution." James's heart clenched at her words. The thought of that sweet child in a strange home, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, made his chest ache. Before he could stop himself, words tumbled from his lips. What if I became his foster parent?" James blurted out, surprising even himself with the suggestion. There was a pause on the other end of the line. James held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. He hadn't planned to say it, but now that the words were out, he realized how desperately he wanted it to be true. "Dr. Lawson," the social worker began carefully, "becoming a foster parent is a big decision. It's not something to be taken lightly." "I know," James replied, his voice gaining strength. "But I can't stop thinking about him. I feel connected to him somehow. Please, can you tell me more about the process?" The next few weeks were a whirlwind for James. After countless phone calls, interviews, and home visits, he was finally approved as Alexander's foster parent. His heart swelled with joy when he brought the tiny bundle home for the first time. "Welcome home, Alexander," James whispered, cradling the baby close to his chest as he stepped through the front door. The name had come to him naturally, feeling right for this precious child who had already changed his life so much. The first night was a challenge. Alexander woke up every 2 hours, his cries piercing the quiet of the night. James stumbled out of bed each time, bleary-eyed but determined to comfort the little one. "Shh, it's okay," he murmured, gently rocking Alexander in his arms. "Daddy's here." The words caught in his throat. Daddy. He never thought he'd hear himself say that word. Tears welled up in his eyes as he looked down at Alexander's tiny face, now peaceful in sleep. Days blended into nights as James adjusted to life with a newborn. His medical training helped, but nothing could have prepared him for the overwhelming love he felt for this child. Every diaper change, every feeding, every sleepless night was a reminder of the precious gift he'd been given. One afternoon, as James sat in his armchair with Alexander nestled against his chest, he felt a sense of completeness he'd never known before. The house that had once felt so empty was now filled with the soft sounds of baby breaths and occasional coos. "You know, little one," James said softly, running a gentle finger along Alexander's cheek. "I think you've saved me as much as I've saved you." Alexander's tiny hand wrapped around James's finger, and in that moment, James knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the weeks turned into months, James found himself falling into a comfortable routine with Alexander. The early morning feedings, once a struggle, became precious moments of bonding. James would cradle Alexander in his arms, humming softly as he gave him his bottle. "There you go, little man," James would whisper, his heart swelling with love as Alexander's tiny hand reached up to touch his face. Bath time became a favorite part of their day. James would carefully lower Alexander into the warm water, supporting his head as the baby splashed and giggled. The sound of Alexander's laughter was like music to James's ears, filling the once quiet house with joy. As Alexander grew, so did James's confidence as a father. He learned to interpret each cry, knowing when his son was hungry, tired, or just wanted to be held. The sleepless nights and endless diaper changes no longer felt like chores, but rather expressions of love. One sunny afternoon, James took Alexander for a walk in the park where he had found him. As they strolled along the path, James pointed out the trees, flowers, and birds to his son. "See that, Alexander?" James said, gesturing to a nearby branch. "That's where you get your beautiful singing voice from." Alexander babbled happily in response, his eyes wide with wonder at the world around him. James felt a lump form in his throat as he realized how much his life had changed in such a short time. The loneliness that had once consumed him was now a distant memory, replaced by the overwhelming love he felt for this precious child. As they sat on a bench, James held Alexander close, inhaling the sweet baby scent of his hair. "You're my miracle, Alexander," he murmured. "I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I promise I'll always be here for you." Alexander snuggled closer, his tiny fingers gripping James's shirt. In that moment, James knew that he and Alexander were meant to be a family, bound by a love stronger than any biological tie. Alexander cooed and waved his tiny hands, captivated by the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. James chuckled, marveling at how such a small gesture could fill him with so much happiness. As they approached the bench where he had discovered Alexander, James felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He sat down, lifting Alexander onto his lap. The baby snuggled against his chest, content and secure in his father's arms. "You know, little one," James whispered, his voice thick with feeling, "I used to come here to escape my loneliness. But now, thanks to you, I've found a purpose I never knew I needed." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the sweet scent of blooming flowers. James closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the peacefulness of the park and the warmth of Alexander's small body against his. Opening his eyes, James noticed a young couple pushing a stroller nearby. They smiled at him, and he returned the gesture, feeling a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. He was no longer just a solitary figure in the park. He was a father, part of a family. "This park will always be special to us, Alexander," James said, gently bouncing the baby on his knee. "It's where our journey together began, and where we'll make countless happy memories." Alexander gurgled happily, reaching out to grab a leaf that had floated down onto James's sleeve. James laughed, marveling at how such a simple thing could bring such delight to his son. As they sat there, surrounded by the beauty of nature and the warmth of their love, James felt a profound sense of gratitude. The park, once a reminder of his solitude, had become a symbol of new beginnings and the incredible bond he shared with Alexander. As the seasons changed, Alexander grew from a tiny baby into a curious toddler. James watched in awe as his son blossomed, each day bringing new discoveries and milestones. One sunny afternoon, as they played on the living room floor, Alexander looked up at James with his big brown eyes. His little face scrunched up in concentration, and then, clear as day, he said, "Dada." James's heart swelled with joy. Tears pricked his eyes as he scooped Alexander into his arms. "That's right, buddy. I'm your Dada," he said, his voice filled with emotion. From that moment on, Alexander's vocabulary grew rapidly. James delighted in hearing new words each day, from ball to doggy to love you. Each word was a precious gift, strengthening the bond between father and son. A few months later, James stood across the room, arms outstretched, as Alexander took his first wobbly steps. The toddler's face was a mix of determination and excitement as he tottered towards his father. "Come on, Alexander, you can do it," James encouraged, his heart racing with anticipation. With a final, triumphant step, Alexander fell into James's waiting arms. They both laughed, filled with the pure joy of the moment. James spun his son around, their giggles echoing through the house. As Alexander grew more mobile, their adventures expanded. They explored local parks, visited the zoo, and spent cozy evenings reading bedtime stories. James treasured every moment, from messy finger-painting sessions to quiet cuddles on the couch. One night, as James tucked Alexander into bed, the little boy wrapped his arms around his father's neck. "Love you, Dada," he murmured sleepily. James felt a warmth spread through his chest. He kissed Alexander's forehead gently. "I love you too, son, more than you'll ever know." As he watched his son drift off to sleep, James reflected on how much his life had changed. The loneliness that once consumed him was now a distant memory. In its place was a love so deep and fulfilling, it took his breath away. As the crisp autumn air settled over the city, James stood at the entrance of Sunshine Preschool, holding Alexander's small hand. The little boy, now 4 years old, looked up at his father with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "Ready for your first day, buddy?" James asked, giving Alexander's hand a gentle squeeze. Alexander nodded, his curly hair bouncing. "Yes, Dada." James knelt down, straightening Alexander's little backpack. "Remember, I'll be right here to pick you up after school. You're going to have so much fun." As they walked into the colorful classroom, James felt a swell of pride. He thought back to that fateful day in the park when he'd found Alexander, and how far they'd come since then. Now his son was starting preschool, a big step towards a bright future. The teacher, Ms. Johnson, greeted them warmly. "Welcome, Alexander. Would you like to join the other children at the block station?" Alexander looked at James, who nodded encouragingly. With a brave smile, the boy toddled off to play. James watched for a moment, his heart full. He chatted briefly with Ms. Johnson about Alexander's routine and any special needs. As other parents arrived, some tried to engage James in conversation, but he politely kept things short. His focus was solely on making sure Alexander had everything he needed for a successful start. Before leaving, James crouched down next to Alexander, who was already engrossed in building a tower. "I'm heading out now, son. Have a wonderful day, okay?" Alexander gave his father a quick hug. "Bye, Dada. Love you." "Love you too, buddy," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. As he walked out of the preschool, James felt a mix of pride and a touch of sadness. His little boy was growing up so fast, but he was determined to do everything in his power to ensure Alexander had the best possible chance to thrive and grow. As the seasons changed, James and Alexander's weekend adventures became a cherished tradition. Every Saturday morning, they'd set out to explore a new corner of the city, hand in hand. One crisp autumn day, they visited the local zoo. Alexander's eyes widened with wonder as he saw the majestic lions and playful monkeys. James lifted the boy onto his shoulders, letting him get a better view of the towering giraffes. "Wow, Dada! They're so tall!" Alexander exclaimed, his little hands gripping James's hair. James chuckled, feeling the warmth of his son's excitement. "They sure are, buddy. Just like you're getting taller every day." As they strolled through the park, James pointed out different animals, patiently answering Alexander's endless questions. The boy soaked up every word, his curiosity growing with each new discovery. On another weekend, they visited the Children's Museum. Alexander's face lit up as he raced from exhibit to exhibit, eager to touch and explore everything. James followed close behind, explaining how things worked and encouraging his son's natural curiosity. At the water table, Alexander giggled as he splashed around, creating little rivers and dams. James rolled up his sleeves and joined in, showing Alexander how to make a simple boat out of paper. "Look, Dada, it's floating!" Alexander clapped his hands in delight. James beamed with pride. "Great job, son. You're a natural scientist." These outings weren't just fun for Alexander. They were precious moments for James, too. He treasured every laugh, every wide-eyed look of amazement, and every time Alexander reached for his hand. In these moments, James felt the deep bond between them growing stronger. One sunny Sunday, they decided to have a picnic in the very park where James had found Alexander years ago. As they sat on a checkered blanket sharing sandwiches and fruit, James couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with gratitude. Alexander looked up at his father, a smear of jelly on his cheek. "Dada, you're the best dad ever," he said, his voice full of love and admiration. James felt his heart swell. He gently wiped Alexander's cheek and pulled him into a warm hug. "And you're the best son I could ever ask for," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As they packed up their picnic, Alexander slipped his small hand into James's larger one. The trust and love in that simple gesture said more than words ever could. James squeezed his son's hand gently, silently vowing to always be there for him, to protect and guide him through life's journey. The preschool auditorium buzzed with excitement as proud parents and family members filled the rows of chairs. James sat in the front row, his heart swelling with pride as he watched Alexander and his classmates file onto the small stage. The children wore tiny graduation caps and gowns, their faces beaming with excitement. As Alexander took his place among his peers, his eyes searched the crowd until they locked onto James. The boy's face lit up with a bright smile and he waved enthusiastically. James waved back, feeling a lump form in his throat. The ceremony began and James found himself lost in memories. He thought back to that fateful day in the park when he'd found a tiny, helpless baby. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined becoming a father, let alone in such an unexpected way. Yet here he was, watching his son graduate from preschool. James remembered the sleepless nights, the first steps, the first words. He recalled the challenges and the joys, the tears and the laughter. Every moment had led to this day, and James couldn't be prouder. As Alexander's name was called, James stood up, clapping and cheering louder than anyone else in the room. Alexander walked across the stage, accepting his little diploma with a shy smile. He turned to the audience and gave a small wave, his eyes finding James once again. Tears of joy welled up in James's eyes as he watched his son. The love he felt for Alexander was overwhelming, filling every corner of his heart. He silently thanked the universe for bringing this wonderful child into his life. What James didn't notice as he focused all his attention on Alexander was a couple sitting in the back of the auditorium. They watched the ceremony with intense interest, their eyes fixed on the little boy in the graduation gown. As Alexander turned 13, the bond between him and James grew even stronger. The transition from childhood to adolescence brought new challenges, but their relationship remained a steady anchor in both their lives. On weekends, James and Alexander often found themselves engrossed in various activities. Sometimes they'd spend hours tinkering with old electronics in the garage, Alexander's curious mind always eager to understand how things worked. Other times they'd go for long bike rides through the city park, talking and laughing as they pedaled along the winding paths. One sunny Saturday afternoon, as they sat on a park bench sharing ice cream cones, Alexander turned to James with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," he said, licking a drip of vanilla from his hand, "I think I want to be a doctor when I grow up. Just like you." James felt a warmth spread through his chest at Alexander's words. He smiled, ruffling the boy's curly hair. "That's wonderful, Alex. But remember, you can be anything you want to be. What makes you interested in medicine?" Alexander's eyes lit up as he began to explain. "I love how you help people, Dad, and I think it would be amazing to understand how the human body works and to be able to fix it when something goes wrong." James listened intently as Alexander shared his dreams and ambitions. He was impressed by the depth of thought his son put into his future plans. "You know," James said gently, "being a doctor is a big commitment. It takes a lot of hard work and study, but if that's what you're passionate about, I'll support you every step of the way." Alexander nodded, his face serious. "I know it won't be easy, but I want to make a difference in people's lives, just like you do." James felt his heart swell with pride. He pulled Alexander into a one-armed hug, careful not to disturb their ice cream cones. "Whatever you choose to do, Alex, I know you'll make a difference. You already have in my life." As Alexander entered his teenage years, James noticed a subtle shift in their conversations. The boys' questions, once focused solely on the present and future, began to delve into the past. At first, It was just a casual comment here and there, but soon James couldn't ignore the pattern emerging. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Alexander pushed his peas around his plate and asked, "Dad, why is it that I don't look like you?" James felt his heart skip a beat. He looked at Alexander's deep brown skin and curly hair, so different from his own fair complexion. "Well, Alex," he said carefully, "families come in all shapes and sizes. What matters is the love we share." Alexander nodded, but James could see the wheels turning in his mind. He quickly changed the subject to Alexander's upcoming science project, hoping to distract him. As the weeks passed, James found himself increasingly on edge, waiting for the next question that might unravel the life they'd built together. He knew Alexander deserved the truth, but the fear of losing him was overwhelming. One Saturday afternoon, while they were organizing old photo albums, Alexander paused on a picture of James as a young man. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "were you ever married? Before me, I mean." James felt a lump form in his throat. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "I was, Alex. A long time ago. But that's a story for another day. Why don't we focus on putting these albums in order?" He could see the disappointment in Alexander's eyes, but the boy didn't press further. James felt a mixture of relief and guilt wash over him. That night, as James lay in bed, he wrestled with his conscience. He wanted to protect Alexander from the pain of knowing he'd been abandoned, but he also knew that keeping secrets could damage their relationship. The fear of losing the son he loved so dearly kept him from revealing the truth, even as he recognized Alexander's growing need for answers. James resolved to focus on strengthening their bond in the present, hoping it would be enough to weather whatever storms the future might bring. He planned more father-son activities, determined to show Alexander that their love was all that mattered. One quiet evening, as James and Alexander were settling in for their usual movie night, a sharp knock at the door startled them both. James frowned, not expecting any visitors. "I'll get it," he said, patting Alexander's shoulder as he rose from the couch. When James opened the door, he found himself face to face with a well-dressed couple he'd never seen before. The woman's eyes were fixed on him, brimming with a mix of hope and anxiety. "Can I help you?" James asked, his voice cautious. The man cleared his throat. "Dr. Lawson, I'm David Turner, and this is my wife, Michelle. We're Alexander's biological parents." James felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself, his mind racing. How was this possible? After all these years? "Dad? Who is it?" Alexander's voice called from the living room. Alexander appeared beside him, his curious gaze moving from James to the strangers at the door. Michelle gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in the sight of her son. "Alexander," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're your biological parents." Alexander's eyes widened in shock. He looked up at James, confusion and fear etched across his face. "Dad?" he whispered, seeking reassurance. James put a protective arm around Alexander's shoulders. How did you find us?" he managed to ask. Michelle stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Alexander. "We've been keeping tabs on Alexander all these years," she explained softly. "We never stopped thinking about him, never stopped loving him." The weight of their words hung heavy in the air. James felt Alexander stiffen beside him, overwhelmed by this unexpected revelation. David spoke again, his voice gentle. "We know this is a shock. We don't mean to disrupt your lives, but we hoped we could explain everything." James stood frozen in the doorway, his arm still protectively wrapped around Alexander. The boy's eyes darted between his adoptive father and the strangers claiming to be his biological parents. "Perhaps we should come inside?" James said softly, his heart heavy. He led everyone to the living room, where they sat in tense silence. David cleared his throat. "Alexander, Dr. Lawson, we know this is a shock, but we want you to understand that we never wanted to leave you." Michelle nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. 13 years ago, we were in a terrible situation. We had lost our jobs, our home, everything. We were living on the streets, David continued, his voice thick with emotion. We had nothing to offer you, Alexander. No food, no shelter, no future. Alexander listened, his face a mixture of confusion and pain. James squeezed his shoulder gently, offering silent support. Michelle leaned forward, her gaze fixed on her son. Leaving you was the hardest thing we've ever done, but we knew you deserved better than a life of poverty and uncertainty. We've been following your life from a distance, David explained. We saw you grow up, watched you thrive with Dr. Lawson. We waited until we could get back on our feet, until we could offer you the life you deserved. James felt a lump form in his throat. He had always known this day might come, but he hadn't expected it to hurt so much. We've been working hard all these years, Michelle said softly. We have a home now, stable jobs. We're in a position to be the parents you deserve. David nodded. We've come to reclaim you, Alexander, to be the family we always wanted to be. Alexander's grip on James's hand tightened. The room fell silent as the weight of their words settled over everyone. James felt as if the ground had suddenly disappeared beneath his feet. He stared at the Turners, trying to process their words. Alexander, his son, the child he had raised and loved for 13 years, was being reclaimed by his biological parents. I don't understand, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. You want to take Alexander back? Michelle nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. We know it's a lot to take in, Dr. Lawson, but we've worked so hard to get to this point. We have good jobs now, a nice home in a safe neighborhood. We can give Alexander the life he deserves. James looked at Alexander, who sat silently, his face a mix of confusion and fear. James's heart ached, knowing the boy's world was being turned upside down. But Alexander has a life here, James said, his voice trembling. He has friends, school, his routines. This is his home. David leaned forward, his expression sympathetic but determined. We understand that, Dr. Lawson. We're not here to disrupt Alexander's life completely. We want to be part of it, to be the parents we couldn't be before. James felt a cold realization wash over him. He had no legal right to keep Alexander. He had been his foster father, yes, but he had never officially adopted him. The Turners were Alexander's biological parents, and they had come to reclaim their son. I need a moment, James said, standing up abruptly. He walked to the kitchen, gripping the counter for support as he tried to steady his breathing. His mind raced with memories. Alexander's first steps, his first day of school, their weekend outings to the park. How could he let go of the child who had become his whole world? But as much as it pained him, James knew he had to think of Alexander's well-being first. The Turners seemed sincere in their desire to be parents. They had stable jobs, a home, and they were Alexander's flesh and blood. With a heavy heart, James returned to the living room. He looked at Alexander, seeing the fear and uncertainty in the boy's eyes. James knew he had to be strong for him, no matter how much it hurt. Alexander, James said softly, I think we need to hear what Mr. and Mrs. Turner have to say. They're your biological parents, and they want to be part of your life. James took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had to do. He turned to Alexander, who was looking at him with wide, confused eyes. Alexander, son, James began, his voice trembling slightly. There's something we need to talk about. Alexander straightened up, sensing the seriousness in James's tone. What is it, Dad? James felt a lump in his throat at the word Dad. He gestured towards the Turners. These people, they're your biological parents, Alexander. They've come because they want to be a part of your life. Alexander's face went pale. He looked from James to the Turners and back again, his eyes filling with tears. What? But you're my dad. I know, son. I know, James said, his own eyes welling up. I've raised you and loved you as my own. But David and Michelle, They're your birth parents. They had to give you up when you were a baby, but they've been watching over you all this time." Alexander shook his head, his voice rising in panic. "No, I don't want to go with them. I want to stay here with you, Dad." Michelle leaned forward, her voice gentle. "We're not here to take you away, Alexander. We just want to be a part of your life." But Alexander wasn't listening. He was looking at James, his face a mask of betrayal and fear. "You're not sending me away, are you, Dad?" James felt his heart breaking. "No, Alexander. I would never send you away, but we need to figure out how to make this work. Your birth parents have rights, and they want to know you." Alexander stood up abruptly, tears streaming down his face. "I don't care about rights. I don't know them. You're my dad, the only one I've ever known. How can you even think about this?" James reached out to comfort Alexander, but the boy stepped back. He looked lost, torn between the father he knew and loved and the parents he had never known but who shared his blood. I need to be alone," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned and ran to his room, slamming the door behind him. James watched him go, feeling helpless. He knew Alexander was struggling with conflicting emotions, loyalty to the only father he'd ever known, and curiosity about the parents he never knew he had. The tension in the room was palpable, filled with unspoken fears and uncertain futures. A few days later, Alexander found himself standing in front of the Turner's house, his small suitcase clutched tightly in his hand. James gave him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder, but Alexander could see the pain in his dad's eyes. "It's just for a week, son," James said softly. "I'll be here to pick you up before you know it." Alexander nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As David and Michelle welcomed him inside, he turned back to look at James one last time before the door closed. The first few days were awkward and tense. David and Michelle tried their best to make Alexander feel at home, but everything felt strange and unfamiliar. The house smelled different. The routines were all wrong, and Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. "Would you like to see some baby pictures of yourself?" Michelle asked one evening, her voice hopeful. Alexander shrugged, not wanting to hurt her feelings, but also not really interested. As they flipped through the album, he felt a pang of sadness. These were moments he didn't remember, with people who were strangers to him. At night, Alexander would lie in bed staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. He missed the glow-in-the-dark stars James had put up in his room at home. He missed their nightly chats about his day at school. He even missed the way James would always burn the toast a little in the morning. During dinner one night, David tried to start a conversation. "So, Alexander, what kind of things do you like to do for fun?" Alexander pushed his food around on his plate. "I don't know, Dad and I usually go to the park on weekends. We play catch." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Michelle and David exchanged glances, clearly hurt by Alexander's reference to James as Dad. "Maybe we could go to the park this weekend," David suggested, trying to sound upbeat. Alexander just shrugged again. "I guess." As the week wore on, the tension in the house grew. Alexander spent more and more time in his room, looking at pictures of him and James on his phone. He felt guilty for not trying harder with the Turners, but he couldn't help it. He missed his dad, his real dad, the one who had been there for him his whole life. As the days passed, David and Michelle began to notice the subtle signs of Alexander's unhappiness. His quiet sighs, the way he picked at his food, and his constant glances at his phone all spoke volumes. They couldn't help but feel a mix of guilt and sadness as they watched their son struggle to adjust. One evening, Michelle found Alexander sitting on the back porch, staring off into the distance. She sat down next to him, her heart aching at the sight of his tear-stained cheeks. "You really miss him, don't you?" she asked softly. Alexander nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Michelle felt a lump form in her throat. "Oh, sweetie, you have nothing to be sorry for." Inside, David overheard their conversation. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes as the reality of the situation hit him hard. They had dreamed of this moment for years, but now that it was here, nothing was going as they had hoped. Later that night, after Alexander had gone to bed, David and Michelle sat at the kitchen table, both lost in thought. "We can't keep doing this to him," David said, breaking the silence. "Did you see how sad he looked today?" Michelle nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know, I thought we could make up for lost time, but James is his father," David finished, his voice heavy with emotion. "He raised him, loved him. We can't just expect Alexander to forget all that." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their realization settling over them. Michelle reached out and took David's hand. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the pain and conflict they both felt. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we have to think about what's best for Alexander, even if it means letting him go back to James." The words hung in the air, heavy with the sacrifice they implied. But as they looked at each other, they knew it was true. Their love for their son meant putting his happiness first, even if it broke their hearts to do so. The next morning, David and Michelle sat at the breakfast table, exchanging nervous glances. They knew it was time to have a difficult but necessary conversation with Alexander. As their son shuffled into the kitchen, his eyes still heavy with sleep, they took a deep breath. "Alexander, sweetie," Michelle began gently, "could you sit down with us for a moment? We'd like to talk to you about something important." Alexander nodded, his brow furrowing with concern as he took a seat. David reached out and patted his hand reassuringly. "We've noticed that you've been struggling since you came to live with us," David said, his voice soft and understanding. "And we want you to know that we see how much you miss James." Alexander's eyes widened, and he looked down at the table, his shoulders tensing. Michelle leaned forward, her heart aching for her son. "Honey, we want you to be happy," she said. "We love you so much, and we don't want to separate you from someone who's been such an important part of your life." David nodded in agreement. "We've been thinking a lot about this, and we realize that James is your father too. He raised you and loved you when we couldn't." Alexander looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're not mad?" "No, not at all," Michelle assured him, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "We're sorry for not realizing sooner how difficult this has been for you." David leaned in, his voice gentle but serious. "Alexander, we want to ask you something important. Would you like to maintain a relationship with both our family and with James?" Alexander's breath caught in his throat, and he looked between his biological parents, searching their faces for any sign of deception. But all he saw was love and understanding. "You mean I could still see James?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michelle nodded, smiling through her own tears. "Yes, sweetheart. We don't want to take you away from him. We want you to have all the love and support you can get. We could work out a way for you to spend time with both families," David added, "if that's what you want." Alexander's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief and happiness. He nodded vigorously, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. David and Michelle, after much discussion and soul-searching, made a decision that would change all their lives forever. They chose to move into the house next door to James, ensuring that Alexander could maintain a close relationship with the man who raised him, while also getting to know his biological parents. When they broke the news to Alexander and James, both were stunned into silence. Alexander's eyes darted between the three adults, his face a mixture of disbelief and hope. James, for his part, felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by the generosity of David and Michelle's gesture. You're really doing this?" Alexander finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Michelle nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "We are, sweetheart. We want you to have both families in your life," David added, his voice thick with emotion. "We know how much James means to you, and we don't want to take that away." James, still processing the news, reached out and squeezed Alexander's shoulder. This is "Incredible," he said, looking at David and Michelle with newfound respect and gratitude. The day of the move arrived, and the neighborhood buzzed with activity. Alexander bounced between the two houses, helping carry boxes and arrange furniture. His excitement was palpable, and for the first time since meeting his biological parents, he seemed truly at ease. As the sun began to set, the four of them stood in the driveway between their homes. Alexander looked from James to David and Michelle, a wide smile spreading across his face. "I can't believe this is real," he said, his voice filled with wonder. James ruffled Alexander's hair affectionately. "It's real, son, and it's all because these two amazing people want what's best for you." David and Michelle beamed at James's words. Michelle reached out and took James's hand in a gesture of friendship and shared love for Alexander. "We are all family now," she said softly, looking at each of them in turn. As they stood there, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, they knew that this unconventional arrangement was the beginning of something beautiful. Alexander had not just two parents, but three, and a future filled with love and support from all sides. The next day, Alexander bounded out of the Turners' new house, his heart racing with excitement. He sprinted across the lawn to James's familiar front door, barely able to contain his joy. As he knocked, he felt a rush of comfort wash over him. James opened the door, his face lighting up at the sight of Alexander. "There's my boy," he exclaimed, pulling Alexander into a tight hug. Alexander melted into the embrace, feeling like he was finally home. "I missed you so much, Dad," he whispered, his voice muffled against James's chest. As they pulled apart, James ruffled Alexander's hair affectionately. "I missed you too, son. How about we shoot some hoops?" Alexander's eyes sparkled. "Just like old times?" "Just like old times," James confirmed with a warm smile. They headed to the driveway where the old basketball hoop stood, a silent witness to countless hours of father-son bonding. James tossed the ball to Alexander, who caught it with practiced ease. As they played, the familiar rhythm of their game brought a sense of normalcy back to Alexander's world. The sound of the ball bouncing on concrete and the swish of the net were like music to his ears. Between shots, they talked about everything and nothing, just as they always had. Alexander shared stories about his week with David and Michelle, and James listened attentively, offering words of encouragement and advice. "It's weird, you know," Alexander said, pausing with the ball in his hands. "I was so scared I'd have to choose between you and them, but now it's like I have the best of both worlds." James nodded understandingly. "That's exactly what we all want for you, Alex. You deserve to have all the love and support possible." As the afternoon wore on, they found themselves sitting on the porch steps, sipping cold lemonade. Alexander leaned against James's shoulder, feeling completely at peace. "I'm so glad I don't have to give this up," he said softly. "You're my dad, no matter what." James wrapped an arm around Alexander's shoulders, his heart swelling with love. "And you'll always be my son, Alex. Always." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, David and Michelle Turner stood nervously on James's front porch. They had invited him over for dinner, hoping to bridge the gap between them and the man who had raised their son. James opened the door with a welcoming smile. "Come on in," he said, ushering them inside. "I hope you like lasagna. It's Alexander's favorite." Michelle's eyes lit up. "Oh, we didn't know that. Thank you for sharing." The three adults settled around James's dining table, the aroma of freshly baked lasagna filling the air. At first, an awkward silence hung between them, each unsure of how to start the conversation. David cleared his throat. "James, we can't thank you enough for everything you've done for Alexander. We see how much he loves you." James nodded, his eyes growing misty. "He's an amazing kid. I'm just grateful I get to be part of his life." As they began to eat, the tension slowly melted away. Michelle shared a funny story about Alexander's first attempt at doing laundry at their house, which had resulted in a mountain of bubbles overflowing from the washing machine. James chuckled, his eyes crinkling with mirth. "That sounds just like him. When he was 7, he tried to make pancakes for my birthday. Let's just say we were finding batter in the oddest places for weeks." The three of them burst into laughter, the sound of their shared joy filling the room. As the evening progressed, they found themselves swapping more stories about Alexander, his quirks, his dreams, and the little moments that made him who he was. David leaned back in his chair, a look of wonder on his face. "You know, I was worried this would be awkward, but it feels right. Like we're all part of one big, unconventional family." Michelle nodded in agreement. "I think that's exactly what we are. And isn't that what Alexander needs most? All of us working together?" James raised his glass in a toast. "To our unconventional family, and to Alexander, the boy who brought us all together." As they clinked their glasses, a sense of warmth and understanding filled the room. What had started as a nervous dinner had turned into the beginning of an unexpected friendship, all centered around their love for Alexander. As the seasons changed, so did the dynamics of Alexander's unique family situation. The initial awkwardness melted away, replaced by a warm, comforting rhythm that embraced them all. Weekdays found Alexander with David and Michelle, learning about his biological roots and forming new bonds. They helped him with homework, shared family stories, and introduced him to extended relatives who welcomed him with open arms. Weekends were reserved for James, filled with their familiar routines and cherished traditions. They still played basketball in the driveway, watched old movies together, and took long walks in the park where their journey had begun. But the most beautiful moments were when all five of them came together. Birthdays became grand affairs, with 2 cakes, one from each household, and twice the love and laughter. Alexander's 14th birthday was particularly special. James baked his famous chocolate cake, while Michelle prepared a towering vanilla creation adorned with fresh berries. As Alexander blew out the candles, he looked around at the smiling faces surrounding him. His heart swelled with gratitude for the unconventional family he now had. Holidays took on new meaning as well. Thanksgiving became a joyous potluck, with each household contributing their specialties. James's turkey, David's mashed potatoes, and Michelle's pumpkin pie created a feast that represented their blended family perfectly. Christmas morning started at David and Michelle's house, where Alexander opened presents under the tree. But by lunchtime, they all migrated to James's cozy living room, where another set of gifts awaited. The day was filled with carols, hot cocoa, and the warmth of togetherness. As winter turned to spring, they started a new tradition of Sunday picnics in the park. Alexander would toss a frisbee with David while James and Michelle set out the food. These simple moments, filled with laughter and easy conversation, became the threads that wove their lives more tightly together. Through it all, Alexander thrived. He felt loved, supported, and understood by all the adults in his life. The fear of having to choose between his families had faded away, replaced by the joy of having them all in his life. As summer faded into autumn, Alexander's sophomore year of high school began. The young man walked into his new classes with a confidence that seemed to radiate from within. His backpack was filled with fresh notebooks and sharpened pencils, but more importantly, it carried the invisible weight of love and support from both his families. In his advanced math class, Alexander's hand shot up to answer complex questions. His teacher, Mrs. Harris, couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. After class, she pulled him aside. "Alexander, I'm impressed with your progress," she said warmly. "You've really blossomed since last year." Alexander beamed, his dark eyes twinkling with pride. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris. I've had a lot of help and encouragement at home." As the weeks passed, Alexander's report card became a testament to his hard work and the nurturing environment he lived in. A's lined up neatly across the page, with glowing comments from each teacher praising his dedication and insight. One evening, as Alexander sat at the kitchen table in David and Michelle's house, working on a challenging science project, he paused and looked up at his biological parents. "You know," he said softly, "I never thought I could feel this complete." Michelle's eyes welled up with tears as she reached out to squeeze his hand. "We're so proud of you, honey, not just because of your grades, but because of the wonderful person you are." David nodded in agreement, his voice thick with emotion. "You've overcome so much, son, and you've brought us all together in a way we never imagined possible." The next day, As Alexander shared his latest test results with James, the older man's face lit up with joy and pride. "Look at you, champ," James exclaimed, pulling Alexander into a tight hug. "You're going to change the world someday, I just know it." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad," he whispered. "Without all of you." As he stood there in James's embrace, Alexander reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the park bench where he was found, the years of love and care from James, and the unexpected reunion with his biological parents. Each piece of his story had shaped him, molding him into the person he was becoming. As summer approached, the blended family decided to embark on their first joint vacation together. They chose a cozy cabin by a serene lake, nestled in the heart of the mountains. The excitement was palpable as they packed their bags, each member looking forward to the adventure ahead. The drive to the cabin was filled with laughter and sing-alongs. Alexander sat in the middle of the back seat, sandwiched between David and James, while Michelle navigated from the front. The young man couldn't help but smile, feeling the love that surrounded him from all sides. Upon arrival, they were greeted by the sight of a picturesque wooden cabin overlooking the shimmering lake. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine trees. As they unloaded the car, James felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He watched as Alexander playfully nudged David, helping him carry a heavy cooler, and his heart swelled with joy. The days that followed were filled with memorable moments. They went hiking through lush forest trails, James and David good-naturedly competing to see who could spot the most wildlife. Michelle taught Alexander how to skip stones across the lake's surface, her gentle guidance reminding James of his own early days with Alexander. One evening, as they sat around a crackling campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, James caught Alexander's eye. The boy, no, the young man, gave him a warm smile that spoke volumes. It was a smile that said, "Thank you for being here. Thank you for still being my dad." James felt a lump form in his throat. The earlier heartbreak of almost losing Alexander seemed to melt away in the warmth of this moment. He realized that he hadn't lost a son. Instead, their family had grown, expanding to include more love than he ever thought possible. As the fire flickered, casting a soft glow on their faces, James looked around at this unconventional family. David was animatedly telling a story, his arm draped casually over Michelle's shoulders. Alexander was laughing, his eyes bright with happiness, and Michelle, catching James's gaze, raised her mug of hot chocolate in a silent toast. In that moment, James knew that this vacation was more than just a trip. It was a celebration of their journey together, a testament to the power of love and forgiveness. As he joined in the laughter, James felt truly blessed to be part of this beautiful, blended family. One sunny afternoon, James and Alexander sat on the porch swing of their home, gently rocking back and forth. The warm breeze rustled through the leaves of the old oak tree in the front yard, creating a peaceful atmosphere. James looked at Alexander, now a young man, and felt a surge of pride and love. "You know, Alex," James began, his voice soft and filled with emotion, "I can't help but think about how far we've come." Alexander turned to face James, his eyes curious and attentive. "What do you mean, Dad?" James smiled at the word dad. It never failed to warm his heart. "Well, it seems like just yesterday that I found you in the park. You were this tiny, helpless baby, and now look at you, all grown up and making us all so proud." Alexander's eyes glistened as he listened. James continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I want you to know something, son. No matter what happens in the future, no matter how our family changes or grows, you will always be my son in my heart." James reached out and placed his hand on Alexander's shoulder. "I love you, Alex. More than I ever thought possible. You've brought so much joy and purpose to my life." Alexander's eyes welled up with tears. He leaned in and hugged James tightly. "I love you too, Dad. You'll always be my father, no matter what." As they embraced, James felt a deep sense of contentment. Their journey hadn't always been easy, but the love they shared made every challenge worthwhile. In that moment, on the porch of the home they'd shared for so many years, James knew that their bond was unbreakable. As the day of Alexander's big school presentation approached, excitement and nerves filled the air. Both families rallied around him, offering support and encouragement. James helped Alexander practice his speech, while David and Michelle worked on helping visual aids for the presentation. The morning of the event arrived, and Alexander stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie with shaky hands. He took a deep breath, remembering the words of encouragement from both his families. "You've got this, Alex," he whispered to himself, echoing James's favorite phrase. At the school auditorium, James, David, and Michelle sat together in the front row, beaming with pride. As Alexander took the stage, his eyes found theirs, and he felt a surge of confidence. "Good morning, everyone," Alexander began, his voice clear and strong. "Today, I want to talk about family, but not just any family, my family." He paused, looking at the faces of his loved ones in the audience. "My story isn't typical. I have two sets of parents who love me unconditionally, and through my journey I've learned that love, not blood, is what truly shapes a family." Alexander went on to describe how James found him as a baby and raised him with unwavering devotion. He spoke of the unexpected reunion with his biological parents, David and Michelle, and how they all worked together to create a unique and loving family unit. "Some might think having two families would be confusing or difficult," Alexander continued, his voice filled with emotion. "But for me, it's been a blessing. I've learned that family isn't defined by genetics or traditional structures. It's defined by love, support, and the choice to be there for each other, no matter what." As Alexander's speech went on, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. James, David, and Michelle listened with hearts full of pride and love, touched by Alexander's words and the maturity he displayed. As Alexander's speech concluded, the auditorium erupted in applause. James, David, and Michelle stood up, their eyes glistening with tears of pride and joy. They rushed to embrace Alexander as he stepped off the stage, showering him with hugs and words of praise. After the presentation, the four of them walked together to a nearby park, the very same park where James had found Alexander all those years ago. They sat on a bench, the afternoon sun warming their faces. David cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "James," he began, "Michelle and we can't thank you enough for what you've done for Alexander." Michelle nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "You raised him with so much love and care. We couldn't have asked for a better person to be there for him when we couldn't be." James felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Alexander, who was smiling softly, and then back at David and Michelle. I just did what any decent person would do," he said humbly. "No, James," David insisted, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "What you did was extraordinary. You opened your heart and your home to a child who needed you. You became a father when you didn't have to." Michelle reached out and took James's hand. "We know it wasn't easy for you when we came back into Alexander's life, but you've been so gracious, so willing to share. We're not just neighbors anymore, James. We're family." James felt tears welling up in his eyes. He squeezed Michelle's hand and looked at each of them in turn, David, Michelle, and Alexander. His heart swelled with an overwhelming sense of love and belonging. "You're right," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We are family, all of us, and I'm grateful every day for that." Alexander, who had been quietly listening, suddenly threw his arms around all three adults. "I love you all so much," he said, his voice muffled against their shoulders. As they sat there, embracing on the park bench, they knew that their unconventional family had become something truly special. They had moved beyond the labels of adoptive father and biological parents. They were simply family, bound together by love, understanding, and a shared devotion to Alexander. The sun shone brightly on the day of Alexander's high school graduation. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filed in, searching for the best seats to watch their loved ones receive their diplomas. In the front row, an unusual group settled in, James, David, and Michelle, all beaming with pride. As the ceremony began, Alexander sat among his classmates, his heart pounding with anticipation. He glanced over his shoulder, catching sight of his three parents. James gave him a thumbs up, while David and Michelle smiled encouragingly. Alexander felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. When it was time for the valedictorian speech, Alexander took his place at the podium. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing on his family. Today, as we celebrate our achievements, I want to dedicate my success to three very special people, Alexander began, his voice steady and clear. To James Lawson, the man who found me and raised me with unconditional love. To David and Michelle Turner, my biological parents who came back into my life and showed me the true meaning of forgiveness and second chances. As Alexander spoke, tears began to fall freely in the audience. James dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief, while David wrapped an arm around Michelle's shoulders, both of them sniffling quietly. These three incredible individuals taught me that family isn't just about blood, Alexander continued, his own eyes glistening. It's about love, sacrifice, and the willingness to put others before yourself. They showed me that it's possible to heal from the past and build a beautiful future together. In the audience, James, David, and Michelle held hands, united in their love for Alexander and the journey they had all taken together. As Alexander's speech came to a close, they stood up, applauding with all their hearts, their faces shining with tears of joy and pride. After the ceremony, as Alexander made his way through the crowd, he was enveloped in a group hug by his three parents. They stood there, holding each other tight, a living testament to the power of love and forgiveness. After the ceremony, as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over James's backyard, the aroma of grilled burgers and hot dogs filled the air. The sound of laughter and cheerful conversation drifted through the evening breeze. It was a perfect summer evening for a barbecue, and the two families had come together to celebrate their unique bond. James stood at the grill, expertly flipping burgers and chatting with David, who was arranging buns on a nearby table. Michelle busied herself setting out colorful plates and utensils, while Alexander helped by bringing out bowls of fresh salad and chips. As they gathered around the picnic table, Alexander couldn't help but smile at the sight before him. Here were his two families, once strangers, now united in love and friendship. He watched as James playfully nudged David, sharing a private joke that made both men chuckle. "Who wants the first burger?" James called out, holding up a perfectly grilled patty. "Me." Alexander and Michelle chimed in unison, causing everyone to burst into laughter. As they settled in to eat, Alexander looked around at the faces of his loved ones. James, the man who had raised him with such devotion. David and Michelle, his biological parents who had worked so hard to make things right. Each of them had played a crucial role in shaping him into the person he was today. "You know," Alexander said, his voice soft but filled with emotion, "I used to wonder why my life had to be so complicated. But now I see that I'm actually the luckiest guy in the world. I have two amazing dads and two incredible moms who love me more than anything." Tears welled up in Michelle's eyes as she reached out to squeeze Alexander's hand. "We're the lucky ones, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. James nodded in agreement, his eyes twinkling. "You've brought so much joy into all of our lives, Alexander. We couldn't be prouder of the young man you've become." David raised his glass in a toast. "To family," he said, in all its beautiful, unexpected forms. As they clinked their glasses together, Alexander felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. He understood now that love knew no boundaries, and he was truly blessed to have two sets of parents who cared so deeply for him. If you enjoyed the story of Dr. Lawson, Alexander, and Mr. and Mrs. Turner, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.